you are probably throwing away the best decorations your garden could ever have without even realizing it. Every time an old fence board breaks or a weathered piece of wood looks too rough, you think it belongs in the firewood pile or at the dump, and every time you do that, you lose the chance to make your garden feel warmer, more personal, and far more beautiful without spending much money. I used to think the same way until one simple afternoon changed how I looked at every old piece of wood lying around my property. Now, whenever I see an old plank, a cracked post, or even part of an old pallet, I no longer see waste. I see another corner of my garden waiting to come alive. The funny thing is that most people believe a beautiful garden has to come from expensive decorations bought at big stores. They fill shopping carts with shiny ornaments that look nice for a season, and then slowly fade, crack, or end up forgotten behind the shed. Meanwhile, the strongest and most charming decorations are often already sitting in the backyard, covered with dust waiting for someone to notice them again. That is exactly what I want to show you today, because none of this requires special skills, expensive tools, or a large budget. I am simply going to share the quiet methods that helped me turn forgotten wood into decorations that visitors always ask about first. Some of these ideas were shown to me many years ago by an older neighbor who never wasted anything that still had a little life left inside it. At first I smiled politely because I thought his garden looked too simple, but after watching how people stopped to admire it year after year, I finally understood what made it special. It was never about spending money. It was about seeing value where everyone else saw rubbish. Before we begin building anything, there is one mistake almost everyone makes with old wood. And if you keep making it, every project becomes harder than it needs to be. Once you know how to avoid that single mistake, every piece of weathered timber starts becoming a useful part of your garden. And the first idea may surprise you because it begins in the last place most people ever think to look. Dot. The biggest mistake I see is that people rush to clean old wood until it looks brand new, and that is exactly when it loses the character that made it worth saving in the first place. I learned this lesson after ruining several nice boards with too much sanding because I thought every mark had to disappear. Later, an older friend smiled and told me that every crack, every faded color, and every nail hole tells part of the story. And once you erase all of it, you are left with just another ordinary piece of wood. Since then, I only remove loose dirt, damaged splinters, and anything that could become unsafe. Everything else stays because that weathered surface is what gives the finished project its warm and natural look. Most people also make another mistake that costs them money. They buy decorations before they decide where those decorations should actually go. I always walk through my garden first without carrying any tools. I simply look at empty corners, quiet spaces beside flower beds, or the area near a small path where something feels missing. Sometimes I even sit on a chair with a cup of coffee and look around for 10 minutes. It sounds simple, but very few people do it. That quiet walk usually gives me more ideas than browsing expensive garden catalogs ever could. Many years ago, someone showed me another old habit that I still follow today. Before throwing away any piece of timber, I stand it against a tree, a fence, or flower bed for a day or two. I simply let my eyes get used to seeing it there. Very often, I suddenly realize that it would become the perfect small sign, a rustic plant stand, or the beginning of a simple decorative corner that costs almost nothing to create. That little pause has saved me from throwing away dozens of useful pieces over the years. You do not need perfect lumber because nature itself is not perfect, and that is exactly why these projects feel comfortable instead of looking like something taken straight from a store shelf. Once you begin looking at old wood this way, you stop seeing waste and start seeing possibilities everywhere. But before you pick up your first board, there is another small secret that makes every homemade decoration look intentional instead of looking like leftover scrap, and that simple detail changes everything people notice when they walk into your garden. One of the easiest ways I have found to make old wood look like it truly belongs in the garden is to stop thinking about building something large. Most people believe they need enough timber for a bench or a table, and when they realize they do not have enough, they give up before they even begin. I used to think exactly the same way until an older gardener showed me something so simple that I still smile whenever I remember it. He picked up 3 old boards that did not even match each other and leaned them together behind a group of flowers. Then he placed an old clay pot beside them and added a small lantern that had stopped working years before. Suddenly, that forgotten corner looked warm and welcoming, without anyone noticing that nothing there had cost more than a few dollars. That day, I realized people rarely admire expensive decorations. They notice places that feel comfortable and natural. Since then, I have always started with small projects because they are easy to finish, and they immediately change the feeling of the garden. An old piece of wood can become a simple plant stand that lifts one flower pot a little higher than the others. It can become a rustic marker with the name of your favorite herbs. It can even become a quiet background behind colorful flowers where the rough texture of the wood makes every green leaf stand out a little more. Very few people do this because they believe every decoration has to be complicated. In reality, the simplest ideas often create the strongest impression. Another habit I learned many years ago is to group decorations instead of placing them one by one across the whole garden. When three simple wooden pieces stay together, they tell a story. A weathered board, an old watering can, and a flower pot create a small scene that draws your eyes naturally. If you separate those same items across the yard, each one looks forgotten instead of intentional. This little trick costs absolutely nothing, yet it completely changes how visitors see your garden. Most people cannot explain why one garden feels peaceful while another feels cluttered, but this is often the reason. There is one more forgotten method I always use before I place the final decoration, and it makes old wood survive much longer outdoors while keeping its natural appearance. Almost nobody talks about it today, and that is exactly where we are going next. Dot. The old method that has stayed with me for years is so simple that many people do not believe it can make such a big difference. Before any piece of old wood goes into my garden, I never paint it with bright colors, and I almost never cover it with thick, glossy finishes. Instead, I clean it gently, let it dry completely, and then protect it with a light coat of natural oil or an outdoor wood preservative that keeps moisture from soaking deep into the grain, while allowing the wood to keep its weathered look. That old appearance is exactly what gives the decoration its charm. Once the wood is protected, I leave it outside for another day before placing it where it belongs. During that time, I often move it 2 or 3 times because the first location is not always the best one. Most people make the mistake of putting every decoration in the center where everyone can see it immediately. I have learned that the most beautiful corners are often the quiet ones. A small wooden ladder beside climbing flowers, a simple shelf attached to an old fence holding two clay pots, a short section of an old log standing beside lavender with a lantern resting on top. None of these ideas are expensive and none of them require special woodworking skills. They simply make the garden feel lived in and welcoming. One little trick that was shown to me many years ago still surprises visitors today. I mix different heights instead of placing everything at the same level. One flower pot stays on the ground, another sits on an old wooden crate. A third rests on a small stump or a thick board. That tiny change creates depth and makes even a small garden look more interesting without buying a single extra decoration. Very few people think about height because they only focus on the objects themselves. I focus on how the eye moves from one piece to another. That is what creates a peaceful feeling without anyone realizing why. The best part is that almost every piece of old wood can be reused this way, whether it comes from an old fence, a broken pallet, or a forgotten shelf in the garage. But there is one place where I never use old wood, no matter how attractive it looks, because I learned that lesson the hard way. And avoiding that single mistake can save both your project and your plants. One mistake I made years ago taught me something I have never forgotten. I placed an old wooden decoration right against the base of a young fruit tree because I thought it looked perfect there. At first, everything seemed fine, but after a few months, I noticed the wood stayed damp after every rain, and the air around the trunk never seemed to dry properly. I moved the decoration away and the tree recovered, but since then I have always left a little space between old wood and the trunks of trees or the crowns of plants. That small gap allows fresh air to move freely and makes everything healthier. Most people never think about this because they are focused on appearance instead of how the garden actually lives. Another thing I always avoid is using wood that has been treated with old chemicals or heavy paint if it will be close to vegetables or herbs. If I do not know where the wood came from, I simply save it for decorative areas away from anything I plan to harvest. Clean, untreated wood is always the better choice, and there is usually plenty of it if you take your time to look around. One forgotten habit that has saved me both money and effort is using the smallest leftover pieces instead of throwing them away. Short sections become simple plant labels. Thin strips become little borders around flower pots. Even broken pieces can be stacked together to create a rustic display that looks as if it has always been part of the garden. Very few people do this because they think every decoration has to be perfect. I have found that small imperfections often make the finished result feel warmer and more honest. Sometimes I place a weathered crate beside a chair and fill it with old clay pots waiting for spring planting. Other times I lean a single worn board behind a container of bright flowers and suddenly that plain corner feels finished without adding anything expensive. The wonderful part is that every season gives you another chance to move things around and create a fresh look without spending another dollar. After a while, you stop asking what you need to buy and start asking what you already have. That simple change in thinking transforms not only the garden, but also the way you see every old piece of wood. And there is one final idea that brings all of these simple methods together into a garden that feels welcoming every single day. After a season of looking at my garden this way, I noticed something that surprised me far more than the decorations themselves. People no longer asked where I bought things because they assumed I had built the garden slowly over many years. Friends would stop beside a simple wooden plant stand or an old crate filled with flowers and ask where they could find one just like it. They were often surprised when I smiled and told them it had once been part of an old fence or a forgotten shelf that almost ended up in the trash. That is when I realized the real value of these old methods. They are not only about saving money. They make the garden feel personal because every piece has its own history. Every season I add only one or two small projects, and that is enough. I never rush because a garden should grow naturally just like the plants inside it. Many people believe they need to finish everything in one weekend, but that usually leaves the space looking crowded instead of peaceful. I prefer walking through the garden every few weeks and asking myself one simple question. Does this corner need something, or does it simply need more time? Very often the answer is time. Another habit that has helped me for years is changing small decorations with the seasons instead of rebuilding the whole garden. In spring, I place old wooden boxes filled with bright flowers near the entrance. During summer, I add lanterns and clay pots on weathered boards beside the seating area. In autumn, I replace flowers with pumpkins, dried branches, and baskets, while the same old wood stays exactly where it has always been. That means I spend very little money, but the garden always feels fresh. Very few people think about reusing the same wooden pieces in different ways throughout the year, and that simple idea creates endless new combinations without filling the garage with expensive decorations. The greatest reward comes quietly. I spend more time sitting in the garden than working in it because every little improvement encourages me to slow down and enjoy the space I have created with my own hands. And there is one final lesson that brought all of this together for me. It has nothing to do with wood itself. Yet, it completely changed the way I look at every garden project, and it is the thought I want to leave you with. Next dot. When I look around my garden today, I no longer see expensive decorations or perfect designs, and honestly, I do not miss them at all. I see old wood that was given a second chance, and simple ideas that slowly turned an ordinary yard into a place where I truly enjoy spending my time. That is probably the biggest lesson I have learned over the years. A beautiful garden is not built by spending more money. It is built by paying closer attention to the things most people walk past every single day. Every weathered board, every forgotten crate, every old piece of timber has the chance to become something useful if you stop rushing and allow yourself to look at it differently. You do not need to copy every idea I have shared today because your garden is different from mine, and that is exactly how it should be. Start with one small project. Pick one old piece of wood that has been sitting behind the garage or leaning against the fence for years. Clean it carefully, protect it from the weather, and place it somewhere that feels empty. Then live with it for a few days and see how that little change affects the whole space around it. I think you will be surprised by how much warmth one simple project can add without costing more than a few dollars. Many years ago, someone quietly showed me these forgotten habits, and I am grateful that I took the time to listen because they changed the way I think about gardening forever. Now I find just as much satisfaction in creating a small decorative corner as I do in harvesting vegetables or planting flowers. The garden feels more personal because every project carries a memory, and every season adds another chapter without replacing what came before. If today's ideas encouraged you to see old wood in a different way than the next time you are about to throw away an old board, I hope you will pause for just a moment because it might become your favorite decoration instead. There are still many simple forgotten garden methods that deserve another chance. And in the next video, I want to show you another inexpensive idea that has helped me make my garden more beautiful with almost no extra cost at all.